Okay, we're ready when you are, Mayor.
Okay, so we're on the air.
Yes.
Okay, good morning. Welcome to the regularly scheduled Oxnard City Council Finance and Governance Committee. The date is May 12th, and we'll have the city clerk take the roll, please.
Member Lopez.
Here.
Member Perello.
Here.
And Chair Flynn.
Present.
We have a quorum, and the agenda for this meeting was posted in the City Hall kiosk on Wednesday, May 6th.
Thank you very much. And to make it a little bit more authentic for the audience here, I do have a American flag. I hope that camera focuses on that. Could you rise for the pledge, please? Place your right hand over your heart. Ready, begin. I pledge allegiance to the flag of the United States of America and to the republic for which it stands, one nation, under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all. Be seated, please. Okay, moving right on in the agenda, we will go to public comments on items not on the agenda. And I won't read the whole script. I'll just go over the list that was just submitted to me by the city clerk of those requested speakers. And so let's see here. Madam City Clerk, it appears that, let me just take a look. It appears, and it's kind of hard because of the camera shot. Is it items 1 and 2 only that have speakers?
Yes.
Okay, so there are no public comment, no requests for public comments on items not on the agenda?
Correct.
Okay, fine. Then we'll go to item C, which is the consent agenda. And the only item under the consent agenda are the minutes. What's the pleasure of the committee?
Move to approve.
Second.
Okay, Madam City Clerk, we have a motion by Member Lopez and a second by Member Perello.
Member Lopez.
Yes.
Member Perello.
Yes.
Chair Flynn.
Aye.
The motion carries 3-0.
Very well. We'll move to page 2 of the agenda. Item D under reports. The very first item, City Manager Department. Subject fiscal year 2020 to 2021 preliminary budget review. The recommendation is that the Finance and Governance Committee receive the attached preliminary budget preview for fiscal year 2020 to 2021 and provide feedback. And we'll start before the CFO speaks. Kevin Riper will start with the City Manager. Alexander Nguyen. Mr. City Manager.
Thank you, Mr. Mayor. So I'm going to start and then Mr. Riper will come up. All right, so this is our, and be very careful about our words here, our preliminary general fund budget preview. And see the warning in red in the block there, estimates subject to change as data from the economy comes to us daily or weekly, these numbers may change. So I want to go back to where we were a year ago. So let me explain this slide template. And I'm actually going to start on the far right, where the sun is shining on Oxnard. That has been and must be and will continue to be our goal. As an organization, as a city providing services for this community, we need to achieve fiscal sustainability. And that's only going to happen when our revenues increase to outperform our expenses. So there are examples there about what that Oxnard would look like. And these are only examples, but we have them listed here. We would have a fully staffed public safety services. We would maintain and keep up with our median strips and our trees. We'd be able to maintain our parks at the level that people deserve. We will be assured that our 911 response times are at national standards. Our roads will be maintained quicker. And we'd have the ability to respond to such disasters, whether natural or man-made. All of these items that we strive for are lacking today, but they were also lacking yesterday and the year before and the recent years before that. So I take you back to last year. we were facing a $9.2 million structural deficit. We worked through that. The administration and the council made some very difficult choices. We were able to cut 5.3 of that from our regular budget, which means we were still in the hole. But as you can see, we're starting to climb out. Next comes the mid-year in this current fiscal year after those cuts, and we had indeed made progress. We were down to only about a $2 million operating deficit. So we were actually on target to deliver to you for this coming fiscal year at least a status quo budget that would assure no reductions in service and no cuts to staffing or programs. And then, of course, this happened. So on top of our existing problems, the pandemic arrived. So I just want to be clear that that knocked us off the ladder or the rope that we had been climbing to get out of our hole. So frankly put, the coronavirus, this global pandemic, knocked us on our ass. So what does that mean? Well, obviously, we're in the midst of a recession. Our revenues, just like everyone else's, has cratered. And a lot of the good progress we'd been making is simply halted. And again, that applies to every sector across the economy. There are very few industries that are actually doing well during this recession. So it applies to the public sector as well as the private sector. So we know for sure that for this fiscal year, which ends on June 30, we've already seen significant revenue decline, and we expect it will total up at $8.7 million. And that's a drastic decline in sales tax, a drastic decline in our hotel tax, the TOT, as well as aggregation of our other revenues, such as fines, fees, parking tickets, and so on. So we have to work through this recession, and again, keep in mind where we were and where we need to head. So we're stuck in this situation right now, this pandemic and the recession. I'm calling it the pan-session. I don't think that will catch on, though. So in the language of the public health crisis, you could say that Oxnard, as a city organization, had underlying conditions prior to the pandemic. Now, most cities, certainly in California, but I believe across the nation, are going to be suffering severely from this recession. A very small handful of cities, I believe, will be able to ride this out, especially if the recession ends sooner than later, because a very small handful of cities have actually, over the years, built up a healthy reserve. Like most cities, Oxnard is not one of those cities. So this pandemic is hitting us extremely hard. So what does recovery look like? Well, we know that we have revenue loss, which is staggering. There are many things that are still unknown. Lots of good guesses out there, lots of educated guesses, but ultimately there are many unknowns. And what we do have in the general fund reserve, we will have to use. Now, a reminder, this is exactly the kind of moment that reserves are set aside for. That's why they call it a rainy day fund. So we're going to have to use those. So looking forward, as we get back on this rope and try to climb out of this hole, we know we're certain that this year it's 8.7 million, and the data tells us that next year it's going to be, there was a range initially between 8 and 12 million. For the purposes of this budget, we believe we are able to bake in 9 million in revenue decrease for the coming fiscal year. So this slide summarizes everything. And again, I just want to point out to you that we are, you read it from the left, where we were. Whoops, I went off the screen there. Where we were last year. our efforts to achieve stability, halfway through the year, we were actually making progress. Then the pandemic hits and the recession ensues. So from where we were trying to climb out of the hole, the pandemic knocks us on our ass. Now, unlike the private sector, we have no choice. We've got to get back on this rope to try to climb out. We can't call a timeout. We can't forfeit. We can't suspend the season. We have to continue day after day. So now we're further down in this hole than we were just 4 or 5 months ago, and certainly a year ago. So we're here. We've got to get here. It's a long way back up. This coming year isn't going to help us very much to get out of this hole. But as a reminder, we have to work for the recovery, but this is always our goal. It must be. And it's going to take a lot for us to climb up here and get out of this hole so that we can move forward again and achieve budget sustainability. And there's no question about it, that's going to require, and it sounds very counterintuitive during these very difficult times, it will require us to have a sales tax increase, and we can talk about that more in the coming weeks. But again, this slide shows you the whole story of just what I say is a 2-year snapshot for Oxnard. Going back to last year, looking at what's happening right now, looking at this upcoming year, and looking out beyond the 2021 budget cycle to achieve this. So with that, I'm going to hand it over to our CFO.
Thank you, Mr. City Manager. Mr. Riper?
Yes, Chair, committee members. The next couple of slides talk about specific fiscal impacts and where we project our reserve level versus City Council targets will be at the end of the budget year in question, fiscal 2021. But first, an update on the various tools that we have to address the collapse of general fund revenue that the city manager just detailed. He mentioned that we are forced to use general fund reserves. This fiscal year, we are burning through $8.7 million in just 4 months. That's an annual rate of $26 million in reserves per year if it had been extended over a full year. As I will show in the next, in the slides at the end, at that rate, reserves could be essentially gone by the end of fiscal year 2021. Another budget reduction mechanism for this fiscal year next is that we have asked the bargaining units to freeze all increases of previous compensation increases granted, largely in the health contribution, in the city's contribution toward health insurance. If the bargaining units were to respond favorably to that, that would generate general fund savings at an annual rate of $3.5 million. The city is still awaiting a response from the bargaining units on that proposal. Another thing you do during recessions is to freeze most hiring. That's probably $1 million because we can't freeze every position. There are some positions that are mandated, and there's an urgent need to fill some positions. So maybe $1 million a year from a hiring freeze. Since we already have substantial vacancies coming into this pandemic-induced recession, and we were already counting on significant savings from general fund vacancies, this is a relatively small number from a hiring freeze. Another thing you do during recessions is you go over your existing contracts and your memberships. It's probably a few $100,000 to be saved there at most because they don't make up much of a very large portion of the general fund. The city has already made a decision to lay off all its part-time employees and to cancel the fire department academy for this year. That's several hundreds of thousands of dollars. And yes, tens of thousands and hundreds of thousands of dollars add up, but they pale in comparison to $8.7 million of lost revenue in just 4 months. Another standard tactic in recessions is to do furloughs, but furloughs carry their own cost because they result in lower service levels, and we're trying to avoid furloughs because we feel the city's already lean on its workforce and its service level provision. Ditto for eliminating entire programs. Programs were significantly reduced or eliminated a year ago, and there's not much left to eliminate. And then finally, our next agenda item, which is not a budget item, it's a cash flow item, is a proposal to allow the general fund to stay positive on cash by borrowing money from the enterprise funds to make up for the collapse in general fund revenue and for the governor's deferral of sales tax payments to the state and therefore to us by most businesses. That doesn't affect the budget, but it does affect cash flow, and it's something we have to do during the recession. Where does that leave us with the general fund? I'm going to talk about revenues, expenditures, operating deficit, and remaining fund balance. 4 slides, one for each of the 4 different concepts. And I want to start by focusing on the far right of this table. The Finance Department's projections here are at the 50% confidence level. And 50% confidence level does not mean we're 50% confident the forecast is right. What it means is that it's a middle-of-the-road estimate. The chances are 50% that the forecast is too high and 50% that the forecast is too low compared with what will actually happen. In other words, we're aiming for right down the middle of the road. What's our best guess, our best estimate of where revenues and expenditures will be? We are deliberately in the Finance Department trying not to be overly conservative and not to be overly liberal. That's a policy decision for the city manager to present to the city council. It's not up to the Finance Department to be conservative or aggressive in forecasting revenues and expenditures. So with that caveat, here's the forecast. As the city manager already mentioned, for the current fiscal year, we've experienced an $8.7 million decline in general fund revenue this year. That's the reserves that we're burning through. And the city manager also mentioned a $9 million decline from the pre-recession forecast for the budget year. So a big hit to revenues. On the spending side, we are assuming for the current fiscal year essentially no change in net spending because our assumption is that through the fire department's relationships with the Federal Emergency Management Agency, or FEMA, and the California Office of Emergency Services, or Cal-OES, and their familiarity with requesting disaster reimbursement, honed over the years through wildfire reimbursement, we're projecting and we're assuming and expecting that the fire department will be able to secure enough revenue to offset the hundreds of thousands of dollars, not millions of dollars, of additional direct COVID-19 response costs the general fund is incurring. So for the current year, a forecast, no change to budgeted revenues. For next fiscal year, various operating departments have proposed reductions and elimination of vacant positions totaling about $3.3 million. So that's a $3.3 million reduction in projected spending for next fiscal year compared with what I presented to this committee in February and to the full council in March. So that's the spending picture for this year and next. Where's that leave the projected operating deficits? This slide shows that the current fiscal year, we're expecting the general fund to spend almost $11 million more than it takes in. And that's the hit on reserves in total. We were already going to spend $2 million more than we projected to take in, as the city manager showed in his pandemic timeline graph. And then you add the $8.7 million of lost revenue, and you get $10.8 million operating deficit this fiscal year. And then next fiscal year, the drop in revenue of $9 million minus the 3.3 the operating departments have reduced in spending means we would eat through reserves to the tune of $5.8 million next year. So an $11 million general fund operating deficit on a $130 million base this year, and a $5.8 million, almost $6 million operating deficit next fiscal year, also on a base of about $130 million. Where does that leave us in terms of target for general fund reserves that the city manager also previewed? That's this last slide. General fund reserves at June 30th of this year, month and a half from now, projected at $8.9 million. That's 6.2% of expenditures. City Council's policy target is 12%. And you'll recall that prior to fiscal year 1920, that policy target was 18%. And during the last budget season, staff recommended and council adopted a lower policy target of 12% because of the existence of cash balances that could be tapped in an emergency, which has now happened in the utility enterprise funds, and which is the subject of our next agenda item. So, 6% of expenditures, reserves equal to 6% of expenditures at the end of this year, and then next year, reserves would be down to $3 million or 2% of expenditures. Almost gone under the fund balance projection after the department proposed reductions of $3.3 million that I mentioned earlier. That concludes our presentation, and the city manager and I are prepared to answer any questions.
Thank you very much, Mr. Riper. Excellent information, and I'm sure the committee members will have a lot of comments and questions. We have 3 speakers on this item. The very first speaker is Raymond Blattel, to be followed by Jim Lavery.
Ray?
Yes.
Hi, it's Michelle from the council meeting. You've got
Right.
you've got 3 minutes to comment on item D1, please. Go ahead.
I got 3 minutes? Okay, fine. Thank you. Slide number 2. I'm sorry, committee chair and members. Slide number 2 indicates that at the start of fiscal year 2019 and 20, $5.3 million in permanent budget cuts were made in addition to some tough choices. Given these stated tough choices and permanent budget cuts, I would ask you to explain why then, as of February the 4th, 2020, 56 new hires were brought on board. And as stated on slide number 3, in February of 2020, there was still a $2 million operating deficit. Then why all the new hires given the deficit? Slide number 8, one option which is included here is furloughs. However, the disclaimer says the city is already lean. Really? How so when the city has hired 56 more people as of mid-year 2019 and 20? Some options which were not included on the slide are as follows. Number 1, request the unions, fire, police, MMA, etc., to relinquish the recent MOU concessions for health benefits. The concessions for public safety alone will cost the taxpayers in excess of $20 million over the next 3 years, and the cost will continue beyond the 3rd year. Number 2, consider the elimination of some of the deputies and assistant positions. Some senior staff members have both assistants and deputies. The senior staff are already handsomely compensated and should be able to do without one or the other. Yes, some senior staff have already accepted pay cuts, but there are more layers on the onion that can be peeled. Number 3, consider the outsourcing of certain city functions and services. And 4, strongly recommend you better control the overtime expenditures for the remainder of the year and following years to rein in the costs. Overtime is already out of control. I certainly hope that the reduction or elimination of services and our programs is not on the table. After all, the sole purpose of government is to provide services to the public. And lastly, look for redundancies. Every government organization has some degree. Seek it out and eliminate it. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, and we'll have Mr. Riper and or Mr. Nguyen respond to all of the questions, or to the majority of the questions after all the speakers have had a chance to speak. We'll go on to Mr. Lavery, please, Madam City Clerk.
Good morning, Jim. It's Michelle from the committee meeting.
Hi, can you hear me?
Yes,
Yes.
we can. And you've got 3 minutes to comment on D1. Go ahead, please.
Okay, thank you. One of the things I appreciate the staff work in this effort, but one of the things I can't understand is the schedules. All the numbers seem to be taken out of context. I don't know where the 9 million comes from or the 10 million. I know they explained it, but we need to see schedules that have fund balances, revenues, and expenditures, so you can see where the different components of the changes are, and that's what's missing. And another thing is, we need to know what assumptions are in the budget. What are the salary savings amounts? What about vacant positions? How many vacant positions are you assuming? I know in this year's budget, for example, Measure O assumed a lot of the costs in the general fund item. Is that going to happen next year? Oh, there are a lot of things like that need further explanation. And another thing is, for example, it seems to me that the city may be underestimating the severity of the problem. There's an excellent article in the LA Times today in the California section talking about Santa Monica. It said the city's grim preview of a crisis ahead. Now, it said by June 2021 that they're facing $226 million shortfall. Now, I don't know if that's a cumulative shortfall or 1 year, but Oxnard is only 10 million. I mean, that seems to be too low. And also, they said they're laying off or buying out 373 positions. And that's in the article in today's paper. So what are they doing? Then that's a very affluent city. So how can Oxnard afford just to borrow from the utilities and to freeze wage increases? It doesn't seem to me that that's close to being enough to solve this problem. It seems like it's very understated. So I'd like the staff to address that as well. There's other things, but I don't really have too much time to talk about it. I would consider, for example, in the police department, if there's always seems to be 10% vacancies in police officer positions, and if that's 20 positions, freeze half of them, freeze 10 positions, and you save well over $1 million right there. So I'd like to see things like that, more innovative things, not doing the same old, same old. You know, try new models of how we do city business. And I think that needs to be addressed as well. Okay, thank you very much.
Thank you very much. And once again, the questions will be addressed after all the speakers have spoken. And the last speaker on item D1, Gabriel Tehran, please.
Morning, Gabe. It's Michelle from the committee meeting.
Hi, good morning. This is Gabe.
Hi. So you've got 3 minutes to comment on D1, please. Go ahead.
Great. Thank you very much. Good morning, Mr. Mayor, committee members. I want to thank Mr. Riper and his staff for the work that they've done in the presentation. Also to Ms. Katie Casey for the impressive user-friendly graphics for the presentation. They're very helpful. I just wanted to say that this information is so important, and I still highly encourage city staff to please provide public outreach through virtual means in lieu of public meetings given our social distancing orders. And this can be virtual community meetings to allow live Q&A, or this can be pre-recorded presentations that are then maybe posted to the city's YouTube channel for public viewing. And that can also lead to exponential sharing on social media by people who view it on YouTube. So I just hope that the city's looking at different ways to provide our economic outlook to city residents so that they're fully aware of this. And I also look at, how Mr. Riper is obviously a very knowledgeable, seasoned expert in this field. He knows a lot of what he's talking about. And I appreciate the presentations being made as simple as possible for myself and for the general public. So thank you for making them easily digestible with the information. And any more simple you can make it, even better. In addition to that, though, I also encourage the general public to please view these presentations, send questions and answers to the city or to your elected officials, anything you don't understand, so that you can fully understand this and what's going on and how it affects us in our daily lives. And I also want the public to know that these presentations, us being aware of it, that's just as much as part of the solution as visiting your local businesses or volunteering to clean up your park's landscaping. I still see a lot of questions on social media about noticeably reduced levels of service from the city that are a result of cuts that were made 10 months ago and people just not being aware of that. Mm-hmm. So I just really ask people to please get engaged. Please view these presentations. It works both ways. I'm asking the city to give these presentations to the public in some way, but the public also has to be receiving them and viewing them and asking questions and fully understanding where it is, so that we all know where we are part of the solution to this as well and what we can do to get through this. Thank you very much for your time. I appreciate it.
Thank you very much. And Madam City Clerk, that appears to conclude the speakers on item D1. Is that correct?
That's correct.
Okay, very well. So we've had 3 speakers, and these speakers have made a variety of comments, and they've had questions. And so the first one was Ray Blatel, and I think what he had to say had to be, if the city is at a deficit or running a deficit, how come there were 56 new hires? And so I don't know if it's Mr. Nguyen or Mr. Riper that'd like to respond to that, please.
Mr. Mayor, it's the city manager. I'll start, and then at some point, Mr. Riper will also chime in to these questions and comments. Mm-hmm. So with regard to Mr. Blatel, and Mr. Blatel, thank you for not only calling in, but sending us your comments ahead of time. I appreciate that. So with regard to the new hires that he's questioning, so a couple points. Number one is, once we settled on the cuts and passed the budget last year, it didn't mean that the city froze in time. We still have work to do, and things still occur. So a couple points there. One is, during that budget, I made it very clear that, again, it seemed counterintuitive, but while we were forced to cut positions, there were certain positions we needed to add. And indeed, we did add some of those. One example is in the finance department. And I point out to you that it contributed greatly to what was lacking and what was needed. And we ended up this year with our audit for the first time since 2015, no findings of material weakness. We needed to shore up the department. We also have people who promote into positions, and therefore their positions become vacant. We still have people who resign for various reasons, and we still have people who retire. So we have to replenish the workforce. That's why we continue to hire. There's a mix of reasons. Mr. Blatel also made a comment about getting rid of senior management. In an organization, especially one of this size, you have to have an appropriate number of managers. This is one of the reasons why this city got into a lot of trouble in the past, because it was not properly managed. So you're not going to have an organization without management. And to think that the managers can do all the work through up and down through the organization is really not sensible. And then finally, one of the points Mr. Blatel makes, which I find fascinating, is he says that the sole purpose of government is to provide services to the public or constituents, and not to see how many people they can put on the payroll to bolster the budget. Well, I asked Mr. Blatel, how do you think the services are provided? It's very simple. They're provided by people, by human beings. We don't provide services with robots, not with computer software, and we don't have a plethora of self-serve services. So when our residents and our businesses call 911, it's human beings who show up. When there's a car accident, human beings show up. When there's a fire, human beings show up. Who do you think collects the garbage every week? Human beings. Who do you think keeps the sewer plant running so that everyone can flush safely in this town? Human beings do that. And who do you think provides food for seniors right now? Human beings do that. Our organization is all about personnel and staff. It's that simple. He made one more comment about, not seeing on the slides, asking staff for some concessions. It's actually on one of the slides. We are asking for that. Now, I'm going to go on to Mr. Lavery's comments, and the one thing I want to say there, and then I'll hand it over to Mr. Riper's. Mr. Lavery, I appreciate your comments, but recall, as we introduce this is simply a preview. The details that you're seeking will be coming in the next weeks to come. This is simply a global preview so we can brace everybody for what's coming. Now, Mr. Riper will discuss issues regarding are we underestimating what's happening in the other cities. And then finally, with regard to Mr. Tehran's comments, I appreciate your comments, and I fully agree with you that the more we can engage the community, the easier it will be for people to understand what's happening. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Mr. Riper.
So Mr. Lavery inquired about Santa Monica, and coincidentally, I actually spent a good part of the weekend reading the Santa Monica documents, and I did not finish because they're hundreds and hundreds of pages. My first reply to Mr. Lavery's comment about Santa Monica is every single city is different. Example, Santa Monica is an affluent city, as Mr. Lavery pointed out. So its per capita general fund is almost certainly way higher than Oxnard's. So you can't compare their $220 million shortfall with our $17 million shortfall. Mr. Lavery suspected correctly that it was a multi-year shortfall, but it's not 2 years, it's 3. This year, next year, and the following year. The numbers we put up were just a 2-year shortfall, but they really aren't comparable from that perspective. And finally, my sense is that Santa Monica that their general fund budget relies more heavily on group activities than ours does. Our transient occupancy tax, while it's collapsed, is only 4% of our general fund. I would have to go into the Santa Monica tables to see what percentage of their general fund transient occupancy tax and other group activity related and tourism related functions account for, but my guess is it's higher than 4%. So lots of different variables. You just can't make an easy comparison between cities. And I would also like to thank Mr. Tehran for his comments and his encouragement. We appreciate it.
Thank you very much. Now we'll go to members of the committee, and we'll start with Committee Member Lopez.
Great, thank you. Thank you so much for this presentation. And I think, the more that we see it, having these options presented, it really allows us to better understand and better process what is ahead, and getting more updates on what these numbers are looking like is more helpful. So thank you for all the work that's going into this to make sure that we're all as informed as possible. And as Mr. Gabe Tehran mentioned, it is very important for our community and our residents to be informed, and I do appreciate his direct outreach as well with informative videos that do help. Thank you for doing that, Mr. Tehran. So I do have a few questions about some of this information, and some of them have been answered through the speakers' questions. But in terms of the loss in revenue, this is the estimated loss in revenue, but how much, is there an estimate of how much we may actually be able to collect from the delayed sales tax, and what may come at a later time?
Well, we will, the governor's sales tax deferral will defer millions of dollars of sales tax that we otherwise would have received. If every business that has sales tax deferred under the governor's order is eventually able to pay it, then we will get all that money. Mm-hmm. However, because we're in the middle of recession and we read every day and we hear every hour, not every business is going to make it. And so those businesses whose sales taxes are deferred and are unable to pay the state, we won't get that revenue. And there's absolutely no way to know how much that's going to be at this early stage.
Okay, and that makes sense. I think it's just a point for us to not exactly count on, correct, as a safe measure, or being cautious about what we can expect from that when we're considering borrowing the borrowing option, the loan option from the enterprise funds, because we may or may not get the full amount or what we might get back.
The revenue forecast that I've given you for sales tax for this year and next year tries to take that into account using our sales tax forecasting consultant, HDL, and their database. So that's already baked into the budget forecast that we just presented. Again, it could be lower, it could be higher. That's that 50% confidence level I was talking about. But for the cash, you're absolutely right, Member Lopez. Since that cash is not coming in, the general fund risks going negative on cash, hence the proposal in our next agenda item.
Okay, thank you. And I just have two other questions. The option to freeze most of the hiring, where would what departments, or where would some of this hiring at the current stage of open positions, where would we see most of this happen?
That would be likely throughout the organization.
Okay. And can you go over what the schedule of or the planned schedule for the budget presentations and what that will look like in the coming weeks when it comes to council, whether we will hear it again here in this committee, and when we expect the council to take action? I think just for information for the public would be helpful.
Yes, Member Lopez. 2 weeks from today, the City Manager's Office and Finance will be back with more detail on the budget. We will not have the budget document completed by May 26th. Not all the schedules that Mr. Lavery was hoping for will be ready by May 26th. But by the time we bring it to council for the public hearing on the budget, which is the full council meeting of Tuesday, June 16th, the budget document will be available. And then the plan is, after the public hearing on Tuesday, June 16th, at the regularly scheduled City Council meeting of Tuesday, June 30th, would be council review and, we hope, adoption.
Great, thank you. And I just wanted to make one last point in terms of, I think there's been questions out there, and our city manager previously brought this up, that we are seeking, or there's been outreach done to our state and federal representatives who are also hearing from many other cities who are in a similar, if not same position as us, that there is advocacy happening for assistance from our state and federal government, but that is something that we cannot rely on. I mean, it's something that would be helpful, and we could evaluate when that, if and when that assistance comes. But I think it was just important for our community to understand that too. And that would be it. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Committee Member Perillo.
Number one, I would like to thank all of the public speakers that took the time to call in and speak. And again, Mr. Botel, receiving them in writing is a big help. Thank you. Ms. Lopez is a big addition to this committee. She's asked a lot of questions. It's very helpful to have somebody that asks a lot of questions. No diminishment to the previous member, but I appreciate Ms. Lopez asking the questions. The things that come across, the biggest things that come across is the numbers are staggering, and Mr. Tehran made a point about getting this information out to the public. We are fortunate that we had some members of the public call in, 3 people, 2 of them that are paying very close attention, that are considerate. I consider them keeping themselves abreast of what's going on. The vast majority of public does not. Either they don't have the time or they don't have the interest. This will bring interest to them, because I heard somebody mention that there are people that still don't realize cuts were made in certain things. I'm getting calls about things. Why isn't this being done? Why isn't this being done? And I always wonder, where are these guys been hiding under a rock for the last 9 months, 12, year and a half? The points that were brought up on slide 8 about the we burned through $8.7 million in just 4 months and extrapolate that out to a year. It's staggering. That is staggering. And again, Mr. Riper, you bring one hell of a lot to the table as far as putting information out, clearly understandable and appreciated, tremendously appreciated. I'm sure not just by myself, but by a lot of people that like answers in plain English. And thank you. The forecast of confidence, the way you explained that, I appreciate you explained that. But before you get off, that's one thing. If you could explain again the forecast of confidence, because I had always thought it was what you thought, what you stated that it was not. That's what I had always considered it to be. So thank you for clearing that up. The city manager mentioned how the city of Oxnard is in a position because we had underlying conditions, very similar to what's going on with people that they talk about. If you have compromised immunities, you got to be very careful with this virus going around. You're at risk. And to just tell you how careful you need to be, last night I'm speaking with a city employee, and it turned out his next door neighbor, 61 years old, good health. He coughed. 5 days later, he was dead from the virus. I mean, things happen extremely fast, and we have a lot of people, just as in this financial information, that don't believe science and medical advice matter. It does. I don't want to go down to witch doctors and voodoo and stuff like that. There's a place for all that, but science matters, facts matters, educated people matter, common sense matters, and the situation that the city has found itself in over a number of years. There's an old saying, chickens come home to roost. Unfortunately, they've come home to roost a big time here, and we're going to all in the same boat with the ability of this 50% forecast. And the CFO mentioned, we're not trying to be liberal or conservative. We're trying to drive down the middle of the road. I like the middle of the road. Walking on the wild side, it's kind of fun for a while, but it's not easy to sleep at night. In the middle of the road is a good place to be. We're having an item, the next item coming up. I'll have more to say about that, but I don't want to pick on any of the speakers, but there comes a time that when you have heard from numerous times, the government's too big, people are fat, people aren't doing anything they're supposed to be doing, they're leaning against the truck, the shovel is used to hold them up, nobody's working. There is a degree of that. But for the most part, the public has people working for the public to take care of the public. And if the people that were taking care of the public were not there, there's a lot of being said about public safety. I hope people don't ever forget public safety is, I can trust that when the guy across the street from me takes out of his tap drinking water, and the guy across town takes out of his tap and drinking water, we're not worried about somebody getting some God knows what disease because the water's not pure, the water's not treated, or that the sewage that I flush down my toilet doesn't come up in the middle of the street 2 blocks away, or we pollute one large chunk of the ocean and they're fined for polluting the ocean, or worse, and combined worse, get tremendous amount of people sick. The same goes with the trash. The same goes with the street lights working. The city manager explained there are people involved in providing these services. If any of the people involved in having time, being forced to stay home, can come up with an idea of a robot to put the people out of business, I'm sure there's a market for it. But until that time, you're going to need Jane Doe or Tom Garcia, whoever it may be, to come and provide the service that you need to have your quality of life. And your quality of life is considered extremely important. It fits right in with health, safety, and welfare. What kind of quality of life do you want? And when you have a quality of life that you want, there's a price that goes with it. And there's people in educated situations, training, life's experiences that come up to make these presentations that we got tonight. I really hope that we can get this presentation out because having attended a lot of neighborhood council meetings before this virus stopped them, you will see people's faces going, nobody told me that. And you're sitting there in the audience going, this has been talked about for the last several years. Actions were put in place to prevent some of these stuff. People like to chew over the same things over and over and over. And that's not a shot to any of the public speakers today. That is not. As far as the employees and the employees' bargaining groups, yesterday I got a letter from the OMMA, extremely impressive to me as a council member. This group has taken a position to support the request, and my hats are off to them. My hats are off to them. Again, I appreciate the fact that we get this kind of a presentation. We have the time to talk about it, Mayor. And I appreciate my fellow council member asking the questions he did. And I appreciate that we have people that are interested, take the time to call in, send their comments and concerns. I need to say this. I don't appreciate the people that try to stir up ferment in the community and try to run around saying the sky's falling, the sky's falling. That's not helping anybody. That is not helping anybody. There are things that can be changed, definitely. There are improvements that can be made, definitely. But Rome wasn't built in a day, and I'm sure Oxnard wasn't built in a day either. Thank you, Mayor.
Thank you very much. Could we go to slide 7, please, of the presentation?
We're on slide 7, Mr. Mayor.
Oh, we're on slide 7. Okay, I wasn't looking. There we go. All right. I'm looking at the agenda item 1.
Slide 7
okay.
is not showing.
You don't see it, Councilman Perillo?
No, I don't.
I see half of it. Let's see here. Maybe that's good. I see it now. All right. So maybe some see it, but it's showing. Okay. Anyway, so let me just continue. So what I'd like to do for just clarification and transparency, when we're talking about, there's a lot of accounting here. On the one hand, we have an agenda item. The next agenda item is about, dealing with a cash flow problem and borrowing from the enterprise funds to do so. So I'm not even going to talk about that. We're just going to talk about the current fiscal year and the next fiscal year. And this slide does exactly that. It talks about the current fiscal year and it talks about next fiscal year, so that we can really break this down. If we look to the far left on slide 7, it says that the general fund, which is responsible for providing the basic services to the public, and that doesn't talk about water, wastewater, and trash, projected a $2 million general fund deficit. So operating, this is pre-pandemic. And then we see just a little bit over that on the right-hand side here, about the middle. It says that in the current fiscal year, there's an $8.7 million loss in revenue. So if you were to combine those two, I'm just going through the math as simply as possible, and you round them off, it's about $11 million for the current fiscal year. So I would just ask either Mr. Nguyen or Mr. Riper, if we talk about the current fiscal year and not talk about next fiscal year, can we just talk about the current fiscal year? Is the math right that we projected $2 million deficit? There's an $8.7 million loss in revenue. If we round them off, it's about 11. How are we dealing with that shortfall just for this current fiscal year?
Mayor, the math is correct, and that's shown in the middle of slide 11. There's your $10.8 million operating deficit projected now versus in the little square box, in the little box below, $2 million projected earlier. And we're dealing with that by eating through reserves.
Okay. And is that the 8.7 million that, are we going to, okay, so we have 17.7, let's just say it's 18 million in reserves. How much of that 10.8 million is going to come out of the reserves?
All of it.
All of it. Okay, so that answers that question. So we have a $10.8 million deficit for this current fiscal year. The fiscal year ends July 1st, or July 1st begins the new fiscal year, June 30th or whatever, ends the current fiscal year. We have 18 million approximately in the bank at 17.7, and we're going to take 10.8 million from that reserve, that rainy day fund, and cover that deficit. Is that correct, Mr. Riper?
That's correct.
Okay, so we got that settled. Let's talk about the next fiscal year. And the next fiscal year on that slide says that we have a $9 million loss in revenue. And then we have the suggestions about how we're going to make that up. There's going to be, I don't know if we go to the slide that talks about the revenue, how we're going to, there we go, right there. That was the next slide. So $3.5 million in the freezing, the increases, 3.5. freezing most hiring positions, that would be 4.5. So that's half of the $9 million shortfall for next year, or at least less revenue next year. So that's about half. And then how are we making, Mr. Riper, up the other 4.5 for the next fiscal year?
So the slide 11 shows a current projected deficit of 5.8 million.
Okay.
And it's not because of the bargaining unit. It's not because of the $3.5 million requested general fund savings in the bargaining unit. That's not baked into the forecast because the bargaining units haven't agreed to it yet. Instead, there's $3.3 million of department proposed reductions.
That's right.
Which drive the $9 million loss of revenue down to a $5.8 million operating deficit. And then that leads to, I think I see where you're going, Mayor. That leads to the next slide, which leaves fund balance at 3.1 million if no other policy changes are made at the end of June 2021.
Okay. And that's what I was going to end with, and thank you for reading me. So go back to the previous slide, if we could, the 5.8, you were just talking about that. Okay. So that 5.8 million, if we have an anticipated deficit of the 9, and 3.3 are the department cuts. And I know that there's a variety of things. Police department is going to eliminate, funded positions. Fire department's going to be able to save, just under $1 million. I mean, there's a variety of cuts that are going to be made. But if we subtract if the concessions, if the unions agree to the $3.5 million in freezing, and I got to kind of hurry here because I'm timing myself, then that gives us the 3.5, then we have a $2.3 million deficit if the 3.5 come off.
Right.
And then my understanding is we freeze the most hiring. Now that's 1.3. So now we're talking a negligible difference. That's how when we're talking about the current fiscal year and next fiscal year, this is what the balance sheet, this is what it looks like. Is that correct, Mr. Riper?
Yes.
The 5.8, the 3.5 would come off the 5.8. Is that
That's correct, Mayor.
The 3. Okay, and then another 1 million in freezing most hiring. Is that correct? Would a further cut, which would leave us $1.3 million as a deficit after everything is done. The department reductions, the freezing of the increases, and the $1 million of freezing most hiring.
Mr. Mayor, if I may jump in real quick, though, none of those scenarios are good. We're doing our best to minimize the damage here, but none of those scenarios are good because all of those scenarios still leave us in that big hole, right? And so I want to repeat myself because I want to make it clear, and I'm not being shy about this, to get truly out of that hole, we are going to need to increase our revenue. That is a bottom line, and I will be presenting to you, along with the budget, a sales tax increase initiative, and we will do our best to convince you, the council and the public, why it's necessary and why we must do it this year. Thank you.
Thank you. And Mr. City Manager, on that point, the sales tax, a proposed sales tax increase cannot take place unless it is placed on the ballot and the voters support it. Is that correct?
That is correct.
And Oxnard has done that before, and that was Measure O, and that was a half-cent sales tax increase. And I know with this that there will be a proposal that deals with that and something additional. But in the past, because we've required a simple majority to approve that tax, is that correct? Because we haven't, it's a general purpose tax rather than specifically saying what the increases will be for?
That is correct also.
Okay. And when would that, Mr. City Manager, when you're going to present that to the council, a proposal for a sales tax increase, that would, the voters would be voting on that sales tax increase, I presume, this coming November?
Yes.
Okay. All right. Just to get that straight. I want to conclude my remarks. I mean, there's so many more things I could say, but, I've exceeded my time limit. I want to say just quickly, we talk about revenue shortfalls in Oxnard. There are revenue shortfalls in Ventura. I watched the Ventura City Council meeting last night about new fee fee increases in the city of Ventura, and also a little bit about their projected deficit. They have a projected $12 million deficit for, I believe, next year. And I want to say very quickly, when we talk about revenue, Ventura has half the population of the city of Oxnard. They have almost the same size general fund budget as the city of Oxnard. So that would mean that per resident or per capita of the city of Ventura, they have double, almost 2 times the revenue as the city of Oxnard. I won't get into the reasons for that because there's not enough time. The issue of Santa Monica, I visit Santa Monica quite often. Santa Monica has a population of 91,000 people. 91,000. It's over. We have 2.5 times the population of Santa Monica. Santa Monica collected in 2017 $58 million in TOT, in transit occupancy tax. That is about 10 times the amount of hotel tax that the city of Oxnard collects. So there's a good side of that, and there's a bad side. The good side is Santa Monica is a very wealthy city, like San Diego, because they have a lot of tourism and they collect a lot of hotel tax. The bad side for Santa Monica is they're facing much steeper cuts than the city of Oxnard because they're disproportionately dependent on tourism to supply their budget. And so I just want to say, think about that. They have 10 times the hotel taxes. And Mr. City Manager, I know one of the things I think is going to be very important where I conclude here is that if there is going to be a proposal by you to raise sales taxes, I also think simultaneously we need, and we've talked about this before, we need to have that discussion about what are the other ways that we can enhance revenue here in the city of Oxnard. And I'm not talking about pie in the sky things, but as an example, people talk a lot about the marijuana dispensaries. Those are going to be coming online, but they're only going to make a small dent. There'll be something. But I think it's very important as a committee that we talk at some point about how can we enhance revenue here without taxation. And that would be through business, and it would be through free enterprise. So I just want, those are my concluding remarks. I want to thank Mr. Riper and Mr. Nguyen and the committee for this preview.
Mayor, may I make a comment, please?
Yes.
Yeah, Mayor, the 10 times the business, 10 times the TOT in Santa Monica. I know that you often refer to Ventura. Now we're going to do Santa Monica. This is not an attack, Mayor. This is not an attack. I'm concerned about the city of Oxnard.
I am.
We have what are called essential businesses not being allowed to operate. And yet we have short-term rentals down at the beach that are operating. We've had one closed down because there were some real problems with the management of that site. We are having issues with that. With respect to bringing in more income, we've had a presentation from management to us about the fees and how some fees have not been raised in the city since 1972. I serve on one of those committees. And there was a discussion about, well, you know, maybe we don't want to raise the fees. From 1972 to now, the chickens home to roost is an old statement, way older than both of us combined. The things that the city has done have hurt the city in the long run, and they are going to really hurt the city now. I do like the idea of, you know, finding some other way other than taxes to be raised. But we've got some very sharp people helping us get out of this jam, including the elected officials. And when we don't support some of those decisions, or we look for ways to possibly, you know, well, let's maybe not have to face the music and maybe some would say kick the can down the road. We can't keep doing that, Mayor. I can't keep doing that. I don't see any other way. The sales tax thing, I don't like it. I didn't support Measure O, and I think that Measure O was abused tremendously. The operation of a new increased tax is something I have to support. I don't see a way out of it. I don't see a way that when I get off this council, whether it's I drop dead tomorrow or I run or I don't run in the future or I'm reelected, to leave a bucket of you know what for the next people coming on board. There comes a time you got to smell the coffee, face the music, and stand up. And as a council member, I don't see other options. We might have what, you know, I think you use the term, you know, you don't want to have pie in the sky. Neither do I. But when we don't face reality, things like this happen. In the past, the council leadership and management did not face reality. The public didn't pay attention. And we are handling that bucket of you know what right now. And those are my comments. I appreciate your comments, Mayor, but there's some hard decisions by everybody in this council have to make, and they're going to be extremely distasteful. Extremely distasteful. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Thank you, Mr. Nguyen, and thank you, Mr. Riper, and also Committee Member Lopez for your insights and your questions. And last comment that I forgot to address, I'll say it quickly, public awareness. The city manager knows, I speak with him about this just about every time we speak, that, you know, we have a not one man show, we have a one woman show. And she's helped out by a lot of people. Many people are a part of her operation, but we have a one woman, you know, public information person. She is doing amazing work. She's doing the job of multiple people. And these graphics, as Mr. Tehran had made a reference to, are done by are put together by her and her information. But it's not a question of whether she's not doing a good job or not. She's exceeding my expectations, and I think she should be. You know, she's exceeding the expectations of everybody in the city. I think that we have to find a way to get this information to the public, and it has been a vexing, you know, problem. It's not insurmountable, but I would agree with Councilman Perello, and I would say this is the case since I've started serving government. Most people do not understand the finances of the city. Most people are not aware of what the financial challenges are in the city, and that makes them susceptible to believing people that come along and provide, I'll say, outright misinformation. It's one thing to have an opinion, but to actually misinform people, and I've talked about that before, and I won't get into it, but we need to do a much better job at informing the public. And again, Ms. Casey has exceeded all of my expectations, Mr. City Manager, so we have some challenges that are before us, or that remain. So we'll go now to, let's see here, item 2 on the agenda. This is page 2, and it's 10:39. We know the next committee meeting starts at 11. Finance Department subject, interfund borrowing authority to support cash flow for the general fund. Recommendation is that the Finance and Governance Committee recommend that the City Council adopt a resolution authorizing the city manager through June 30th, 2021 to borrow on behalf of the general fund up to $10 million from each of the Water Fund, Wastewater Fund, and Environmental Resources Fund to support cash flow needs during the public health emergency and its aftermath. And 2, establish a 10-year repayment schedule with interest charged at the city treasurer's pooled cash portfolio earnings rate. Mr. Riper.
Thank you, Chair. The key phrase in the recommendation is support cash flow needs. You'll notice not part of the recommendation is any appropriation request, no budget adjustment. There's no effect on the income statement except for a little interest in the future. This is a balance sheet transaction, and it's required because the general fund can't go negative at the end of a fiscal year with cash. We just spent the last 45 minutes discussing the collapse in general fund revenue. That's hurting the general fund's cash position. And Member Lopez asked about the governor's sales tax deferral, and that's also hurting the general fund's cash position. If we get all that money back from the businesses whose sales tax was deferred, as I mentioned in response to her question, we'll still have the revenue that we expected on an accrual basis, an accounting basis, and a budgetary basis, but we won't have the cash. So there's a risk that the general fund could go negative on cash, and so the general fund needs a temporary source of cash. I don't expect the general fund to go negative this fiscal year. We've got 7 weeks to go. There's $10 million of cash in the general fund as of yesterday, and if things don't collapse further than they already have, the Department of Business and Licensing, the Department of Billing and Licensing, and the Finance Department, our cash flow projections are that the general fund should squeak by with positive cash at June 30th of this year. But next fiscal year is a different story because of that wide range of uncertainty we talked about on the first agenda item. If the recession is long and deep and the revenue forecast is that I presented was too optimistic, general fund could run out of cash next fiscal year. Similarly, if the sales tax deferral leads to significant non-payment, the general fund could run out of cash next fiscal year. Hence the request for a temporary source of cash. A number of city folks, including myself, city manager's office, city treasurer, have observed that it makes sense to borrow internally, not externally, because if you borrow internally, then the general fund is repaying another part of the city. If you borrow externally through a tax and revenue anticipation note or some other, or a letter of credit with a bank or some other external mechanism, then the general fund's paying interest to bondholders or to a bank. So the recommendation is for up to, not an absolute amount, not for sure, but up to $10 million of borrowing by the general fund from each of the three utility enterprise funds, water, wastewater, and environmental resources, to be reviewed by the city manager based on a written cash flow forecast and signed off only by the city manager. It's not something that the Department of Billing and Licensing or the Finance Department could do by itself. Because of the uncertainty surrounding the forecast, the recommendation is a 10-year repayment period. That's obviously a worst case. We'd rather repay it sooner, especially if sales tax comes in. But because the length and the depth of the recession induced by the global pandemic is unknown, I'm putting worst case out here as the recommendation. The interest rate would be set at the city treasurer's actual pooled cash portfolio earnings rate, so that the enterprise funds earn what they would have earned. They would earn from the general fund what they would have earned from the city treasurer's pooled cash anyway. And then a key point is no prepayment penalty, because the hope would be to repay the loan much earlier than 10 years. Financial impact, as I mentioned in highlighting that four-word phrase in the recommendation, there's only an effect on cash. There's not an effect on available fund balance. The general fund to be getting a new asset, say it borrows $2 million from each. The staff report talks about the general fund in one scenario borrowing $2 million from each of the three enterprise funds. It borrows $6 million in total. That's an asset, and then it has a liability equal to what needs to be repaid to those three funds. So there's no change in fund balance, which is the difference between assets and liabilities, but there is a change in cash. The general fund would have $6 million more in cash, and therefore it wouldn't be negative when the books close on a particular year. And for the enterprise funds, again, the effect is only on cash, not on available fund balance. The enterprise funds would be switching out one asset, cash, for a different asset, loan payable by the general fund. That takes us back to the recommendation. I just want to emphasize again that this backup loan mechanism to help keep general fund cash positive is not a license to spend more money. There's no effect on budget appropriations. There's no request for spending more money. It's just to keep cash flow needs and general fund cash balance positive.
If I could add, Mr. Mayor, another way to view this is not revenue. It is not revenue. Just remember that. Thank you. And that concludes the presentation. Mr. Mayor, you're still on mute.
Sorry about that. I apologize. The very first speaker, we have 14 minutes to go till Public Works starts. So we'll just go ahead. Lawrence Paul Stein is the first speaker, and to be followed by Raymond Blotell, please.
Not revenue.
Good morning, Larry. Hi, Larry. Good morning. You have 3 minutes to comment on item D2 for the Finance and Governance Committee.
Okay.
Go ahead.
Mr. Stein,
Yes.
can you start, please?
Thank
You have
you.
3 minutes.
Yes. First of all, I'm dismayed the fact that the city's still breaking the law with the discussions of the sales tax revenue. That's not on the agenda. Sorry about that. I apologize.
The very first speaker, we have
Larry, can you mute your TV in the background, please?
starts. So we'll just go ahead. Lawrence Paul Stein is the first.
Yes, I'm somewhat dismayed with the fact that the city's taking long already for discussion of sales tax proposals that wasn't even on the agenda. The issues, again, I have with the balances of transferring $10 million each from the enterprise funds, again, seems to be violating the law. It's my understanding that you allow 5 years to repay back the money, not 10 years. I've made some recommendations suggesting the fact that things like automobile allowance should be removed. We've already discussed negotiations with unions on this, but I'm concerned the fact, if you say that the enterprise funds have this much cash, why is cash not being used? For example, to fix a sewer plant that need to be fixed. We had discussions 2 years ago that we had over $60 million in sewer plant repair work. We're grabbing $10 million in sewer plants to take care of this. We're not paying for great water. 2009, staff recommended that the GREAT program was going to be the backbone of our water system. You've still not built the wells to provide water for the 40,000 people paying debt service on the GREAT water. We're going to grab $10 million more from the GREAT fund to Oakland Water Fund to pay for this. This really seems to be a subsidy for public safety, among other things. Again, you've had discussions this morning regarding contract negotiations that have yet to be discussed. I'm still concerned with the fact that there's this much cash in each enterprise fund. Why are the utility rates so high? Again, the issue is the cash is being discussed, taking it out from the enterprise fund. To me, the city seems to be stealing money again. We had lawsuits a few years ago. The city was taking $5 million out of the enterprise funds illegally, and the city lost that lawsuit. Again, there seems to be a certain amount of trust or lack of trust in this case that I have with the city and these reports. Yes, the city's in financial desires and needs, but I ask questions, I don't get answers. Again, we have problems with the city. We have trust issues. The city talked about having an increase in sales tax. That was not on the agenda this morning, but you're talking about it. Measure O was supposed to be used for once and only projects, been used to backfill the problems. I mean, they're using half the general fund we're using half the general fund to fund public safety and 1/3 of Measure O for public safety. What happened to fixing our streets? What happened to fixing our pools? I've asked for a pool for College Park. We didn't get the pool, which is $10 million from the utility fund each to pay for to subsidize cash down. Yes, we do need cash to cover things that may be a shortfall, but you're not talking about a $30 million shortfall in sales tax. Again, I understand the needs to make the cash down to the negative. What's the big deal? We had 70 accounts.
Mr. Stein, your time. Mr. Stein, your time is up.
We covered that with $15 million to Measure O. That money
Mr. Stein.
Back. Where is
Mr. Stein.
The
Excuse me. Okay, very good. Thank you. The next speaker is Raymond Botel, please.
Hi, Ray. It's
Hello?
Michelle. We're on D2 now.
Okay, thank you.
Okay,
I'm not going to say much because I'm not going to say much for the sake of time. You've all got my comments via email. I consider the loan risky, but I see you have no other choice because you got to do it. The only thing that as you've seen in my email, was that maybe you ought to consider late payment fees. I know you probably think, well, the taxpayers and the ratepayers are paying for it anyway. Wouldn't you be biting yourself in the rear end? Well, same can be said for the interest. Also, since any loan would be over 10 years, make sure that the information doesn't fall through the cracks. Ensure staff reports the status to the public each mid-year and end-of-year review. Because, for example, loans to the golf course, for example, people, you don't hear about it very often, so you kind of forget about it. We just got to make sure it doesn't fall through the cracks. Thanks for everything. Bye.
Thank you very much. Last speaker, Jim Lavery, please.
Hi, good morning,
Hello.
Jim, go ahead.
Okay, thank you. One of the questions I have about this item is why is there so much cash in the utilities? I remember just a handful of years ago, especially the sewer facility, it was in terrible shape. We had a tour of the facility. It needed tens of millions of dollars in upgrades. So my question is, how come there's enough cash to lend from each of the three utilities? All of these things are supposed to go to critical repairs and infrastructure improvement. So why is the money not being spent? Is it because of staffing shortfalls? I don't know. That needs an explanation. And another thing that just rubs me the wrong way is you're basically going to be using utility revenues to pay for people's salaries in the general fund. And I don't know if it's a good thing. But on the other hand, I don't want the city to go broke either and run out of cash. So I do support this item reluctantly. But now I want to go back to the other item, if I may, with the rest of my time. And one of the things I put forward about all the schedules is that the assumptions matter. You know, if the city says there's a $10 million deficit or $9 million shortfall, or you need to know what's backing that. One of the slides said there was a $2 million deficit in the general fund at the 6-month review. But that did not include general fund expenditures like the funding of station number 4 that was moved to Measure Row, or several other things. There were maybe $3 or $4 million worth of general fund expenditures that were moved to Measure Row. So that $2 million is probably more like $5 or $6 million. So that's why I need to know what the assumptions are before I can say that's a good number, that's a bad number. And also about the sales tax, I have to agree with Larry. We did get kind of sandbagged by this. Now I have really mixed feelings about the sales tax increase. Because on the other hand, I love the city. I live in the same house I'm sitting at right now, 27 years today. But Measure Row was so mismanaged. A $5 million fire station became a $15 million fire station. Every overrun that was ever caused by mismanagement was paid for out of Measure Row. I didn't like recently where you didn't fund, you were supposed to cut $9 million, you only cut $5 million out of the budget, but then you gave a lot of money for raises to employees. Now you have a $3.5 million problem. That bothers me. I don't want sales tax receipts going to fund employees' raises. So there's a lot of issues I have with the sales tax increase. Thank you.
Thank you. Mr. City Manager,
Yes.
with 4 minutes that remain, before we go to concluding comments, and we do have to vote on this, members of the committee, to recommend this to the full City Council. Mr. Lavery and Mr. Blattel and maybe Mr. Stein have all brought up the issue of, why do these enterprise funds, why are they so flush with cash when in fact the requirement is that we keep a 25% reserve? Could you respond to that, please?
So very quickly, they have healthy reserves because we work to have the reserve, and we have capital improvements and renovations that are programmed and planned. We can't do it all at once, and you just received a very public report about all the improvements and capital improvements and renovations that have been made at the sewer treatment plant. So there's progress. We're fortunate that we have this reserve right now, but it isn't there for the sake of being there. It's there because the improvements and renovations are necessary, and we will be working on those. Very quickly, the two things about the sales tax. First of all, it's on almost half of the slides in the presentation, right? On the right-hand column, there's the thing that says sales tax with an arrow up. And I am discussing it early. Would you prefer that I don't discuss this openly and wait until June? I don't understand why people have a problem with sharing our plans and our ideas to the public early. How would you like to have that to the speakers, that we don't present these things until the last minute when the council is forced to vote on it? That doesn't make any sense. And then finally, again, we're not using utility revenue to pay for general fund. It's for the cash flow issue. Like we said, we cannot, we will not, and we shall not treat this as revenue. It's a very fundamental problem, right? If the governor defers payment of sales taxes to the state and hence to the county and to the cities, we have a cash flow problem. That's what it is for. Oh, and then one other thing about the late payment, Mr. Blatel, we appreciate that, but I mean, that's sort of the luxury of being able to borrow from ourselves. Otherwise, if we went to a commercial bank, we would have that as an issue to contend with. Thank you. Mr. Mayor, are you still on mute? As the mayor reconnects, just a reminder, we do need a vote on this to forward to the city council.
Madam City Clerk?
Yes.
Hi, okay, I'm back on. Somehow I fell off and City Manager was speaking and he couldn't hear me. I was not on mute. Madam City Clerk, my last question was, before we go to the council member comments, were only the three speakers, Mr. Stein, Mr. Blatel, and Mr. Lavery, the ones who requested to speak on item D2?
That's correct.
Okay, just wanted to make double check. Okay, why don't we just do our concluding remarks here? It's now 11 o'clock. Why don't we start with Member Lopez again, please?
Great, thank you. Just had a question in terms of what 10 million, what is that based on from each fund? And if the borrowing will happen in a combination of each of the enterprise funds, or is it going to come just from one depending on what the amount is taken?
The $10 million was a worst-case scenario. Mr. Stein made a good point. We're not looking at a $30 million collapse in sales tax revenue, but there's all the other general fund revenue that is at risk. And I'm planning for the worst possible with with that outer bound of 10 million from each of the three. Again, because nobody knows how long and how deep the recession will be. We want the city manager to have the flexibility to keep general fund cash positive. So that's where the 3 times 10 million came from. At the beginning, we'll probably do equal amounts from each enterprise fund, and then if one spends its capital more quickly than others, then we can adjust in any future loans if they're necessary. So we'll play it by ear based on the cash flow forecast for the general fund to determine the dollar amount, and each of the 3 enterprises to determine which ones can most easily lend the cash.
Great, thank you. And then just one more clarifying question. The borrowing will be for the 1920 fiscal year, or are we taking action to leave this available, an option available for the next year as well?
The resolution would be in effect from effective date this fiscal year all the way through June 30th, 2021. So the remainder of this fiscal year and all of next fiscal year. As I said in my opening remarks, I don't expect us to need to tap it this fiscal year, but who knows what's going to happen next fiscal year globally, nationally, and regionally.
Great, thank you.
Thank you very much. Committee Member Perillo.
Thank you for the presentation, and the public commenters, thank you very much. A couple of questions, a couple of statements. The city manager did make a statement, this is not to be considered as revenue. I appreciated him making that statement. With respect to the borrowing, if we borrow some in this fiscal year and we borrow some in the next fiscal year, we will be borrowing, and the loan repayment interest rate agreement will be based on those 2 individual years, or do you combine them from the first time this is approved today and this fiscal year? That's one question. Number 2, when it comes to the expectations, and people are questioning how come we have so much money in these accounts. I mean, the money was put in the accounts to bolster the environmental, enterprise funds, because as people seem to have forgotten, they were on the verge of collapsing. And there was very strong discussions about potential bankruptcy and a domino effect that would happen. And the funds are put in there, and for lack of a better way to explain it, I can't put the roof on the house until somebody's dug the foundation and I laid the foundation. And even then, when that happens, it's a long way before I put the roof on the house. There's, I believe one of the staff said, staged repairs or improvements. But the questions that I have with respect to the interest, that's the only one. I did just recently get an email today from the city treasurer about the interest rates. I do recall that in the past, the city treasurer has recommended that we borrow from internally. I'm glad to see that he's on board with that. It does make sense. I'd rather pay me than pay somebody else. I'd rather pay the city than pay somebody else to borrow the money that they have in place. I support this. Not that I'm looking forward to having more taxes. I don't see any other way out. And for the people that are complaining about us talking about a sales tax, I'm assuming, I can't see the screen, we have a city attorney there. If we'd gotten off base, I trust my city attorney would have reeled us back in and said, hey, stick to the agenda, because we don't want to have a Brown Act violation. So ladies and gentlemen, these people have jobs and they're not paid just to look good and sit there. They're doing their job. Thank you. Those are my comments, and I hope you can give me an answer on the interest issue. Thank you, and thank you for the presentation.
Member Perello, if a loan is made this fiscal year, then the interest rate on the loan will be this year's city treasurer's portfolio-wide earnings rate. And if a loan is made next fiscal year, it will have next fiscal year's city treasurer's portfolio-wide investment earnings rate.
Thank you very much, Mr. Riper. Appreciate the ability to have somebody in the position that you hold respond with a question with an understandable answer. I'm very grateful you work for this city.
Thank you very much. Mr. Riper, I have a quick question. Is it riskier to borrow from ourselves rather than from someone else? It's kind of a trick question in a way.
No, it's not riskier. The issue is repayment, not who you're borrowing from.
I mean, I guess what I'm saying here is, the city's not going to ever borrow money ever with the intention of defaulting on a loan. But when you borrow from your own assets, it's an enterprise fund, but it's part of the city's, portfolio. So when you borrow from yourself rather than borrowing from others, I guess that was really my only question. I know, if we borrow from others right now and for the cash flow, it might have some adverse impact on our credit rating, as an example. But and that's possibly one of the reasons you borrow from yourself. So that was the only question I had. Why borrow from? Obviously there's zero cost for the loan too, right? There's no origination fee, any of that kind of stuff that's generally associated with borrowing money, like bonds.
That's correct. There are no origination fees. But I have to say, in terms of borrowing from the enterprise funds, the general fund better repay the loan, or we're out of compliance with Prop 218. So that's right. A pretty big stick too.
Right. I understand that. Okay. Thank you very much. That was my only question. And the recommended action.
Mayor, may I have one comment,
yes,
please?
Yes. Mm-hmm.
Yes, I'd like to remind, we did borrow $16 million from Measure O, and our manager at that time said we're going to repay it. And technically, we've been informed it was part of the general fund. We didn't need to make a repayment. It was all part of the general fund. I don't want us to mix apples and oranges and all of a sudden come up with pineapples. I just want everybody to remember that. Thank you.
Thank you very much. And the recommended action is that we recommend that the City Council adopt a resolution authorizing the city manager through June 30th to borrow on behalf of the general fund this amount of money. I already read the item. What's the pleasure of the committee?
I'll move the recommended action.
Okay. Do we have a second?
Second.
All right, Madam City Clerk, we have a motion by Committee Member Perello and a second by Committee Member Lopez. The vote, please.
Member Lopez?
Yes.
Member Perello?
Yes.
Chair Flynn?
Aye.
The motion to approve carries 3-0.
Thank you.
Mr.
We'll go
Mayor,
to the
let me-
last item on the agenda.
Yes, Mr.
Yes.
Mayor, one more very quick comment. I forgot to mention this earlier regarding one of Mr. Blatel's points regarding annual review, and this will be reviewed annually, both in the CAFR and the audit. Thank you.
Thank you very
Mr.
much.
Mayor, if I could just address Councilmember Perillo's comment on the Brown Act issue. This is the city attorney. So both the items 1 and 2 of the reports today have dealt with broad-ranging budgetary issues. Several issues relating to the budget have been discussed, not just the city manager's comment about a possible sales tax measure. Other issues such as labor negotiations and other staffing issues have been discussed as well. So those are within the agenda description on item D1 for preliminary budget preview, and they relate to item D2 in regards to how these how this interfund borrowing would be repaid, essentially.
Thank you very much.
Thank you, Mr. Fisher.
Thank you. And the final item on the agenda is future items for the committee. Are there any future items that members would like to bring up?
Yes.
Councilman Perillo, Committee
Yes,
Member Perillo.
we've had an issue where we have non-essential businesses have not been allowed to open, and we are getting a lot of pressure from residents that are associated with businesses or business owners. We have a business, non-essential business, deemed short-term rentals. And I'm wondering, when does the same rules apply to them as they do to other businesses? I happen to represent an area near the beach where I'm getting hammered on this, and I don't have an answer for them. I've asked this, and I'm hoping we can get it on. I can get an answer, but we can also get it on an agenda to have an explanation. Thank you. That's my only question.
Thank you. And before I make a quick comment on that, Committee Member Lopez, do you have any issues that you'd like brought to the committee?
Not at this time. Thank you.
Thank you very much. I'll just simply say, Committee Member Perillo, that just yesterday in the agenda planning, I had made a previous request 2 weeks ago that the city manager and the staff bring forward a presentation to the Finance and Governance Committee on businesses and what we're doing to help businesses. And maybe, Mr. City Manager, this issue of essential, non-essential, high risk, low risk, maybe that can be brought forward to it could be responded to at the same time.
Mr. Mayor, I believe that request actually was to take it to the Economic Development Committee.
Yeah. Yes.
Okay.
Yes.
Thank you.
Oh, okay. Oh, okay. I'm sorry. Well, it could actually, okay, it has implications probably for both, but thank you very much on that. Maybe, again, I don't mind a quick, obviously, update that Committee Member Perillo had that request, so I don't, that's fine. Any further questions?
Yes, Mayor, since the city manager weighed in, has that gone to the committee or has it already been reported to the committee?
Not yet, sir.
No, it hasn't.
It will
Okay,
come.
thank you.
Okay. Thank you very much. This meeting is adjourned.
Thank you.
Thank you.